Hello, my name is Peter Ballerstedt, aka Sodfather. Glad to be here today. Although you won't be listening to me today, it will be today wherever you listen to me. Wonder of Technology. My title today is When Protein Isn't Protein. I'll explain as we go through. So for those who don't know me, I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life, and I work for a forage seed company, although I'm not in any capacity representing that company today. You should know this because that's part of the worldview that I bring to this, but I've discovered over the years that I know things because of my training that many times people in my keto tribe don't know. So hopefully, if not informative, I'll at least be entertaining. All of this was driven by my own personal experience, my N equals 1. So you can see what I look like Christmas of 2007, you know, when you set up the camera on the tripod, take the picture, set the timer, get back in, take a look and go, oh, what's wrong with the camera? Nothing wrong with the camera. Note the Hawaiian shirt, which isn't tucked in. That's nice camouflage. And then 2010, and you can see me today. So if somebody asks whether this is all sustainable, all I can say is I don't know. I've only been at it for 13 years, so we'll find out. But that interest and personal experience, coupled with my background, I really want more people to understand this idea that when you improve your health, you are improving the world. And I want people to put more value in their own health in this way. I mean, it's reasonable to want to improve the world, but let's start with us. And then we'll see where it goes. Like me, I didn't plan to do this when I got started. I just didn't want to be a 51-year-old balding obese pre-diabetic. And so I found a way to reverse everything but the baldness. So maybe, who knows, I'll keep at it and we'll see what happens. So, you know, I can even agree with Dean Ornish on this, that what's good for you is good for our planet. I know that we're going to differ on the details, and this question of protein, I think, is really fundamental to the disagreement or misunderstanding. And a big part of what I want to do is I want to introduce consumers and producers to each other. I want to introduce my agricultural tribes to my keto therapeutic carbohydrate reduction tribe. Because I think we have a lot to learn from each other. If we can learn how to listen, be introduced, learn to listen, and have a respectful conversation, because I think we're interested in the same things. This quote from Amanda Radke: consumers and producers alike care about animal welfare, environmental stewardship, food safety, nutrition, and taste. Yeah, we may have different perspectives, and we should learn from those different perspectives. I think people of goodwill should be able to agree on some things, regardless of which side of the conversation they're coming from. So I think we all should agree that our focus ought to be achieving adequate essential nutrition. And we ought to focus on maintaining or restoring metabolic health. I think those are two that, regardless of what perspective we're coming from, we ought to be able to agree on that. Yes, there's a lot of details. Yes, there's a long conversation. But if we can't agree on those, then don't bother with the rest of it, because we're not really being honest and serious in the thing. So, and then after that, then people should be free to choose accordingly based on their personal preferences, their situation, and knowing how to monitor metabolic health, for example, their own personal responses. But part of this is also to recognize that we live in a world where one egg a day can grow a better brain. You know, some of the things that we're really concerned about in affluent West look a whole lot different when you look at them from other parts of the world. And frankly, some of the people who are advocating for things from the affluent West are kind of tiresome when you go to other parts of the world and see what the reality is. Now, we've got 2 billion people in the world today that suffer from micronutrient malnutrition. We have a quarter of children 5 years and under who are stunted. And this is the result of too little animal source food in their diet. Yes, I'm the sod father and leader of the ruminati. It doesn't have to be ruminant animal products. Any animal products, fish, shellfish, poultry, eggs, dairy, meat, pork. Yes, pork's a meat. The red meat. Yes, pork's a red meat. Okay, ruminant versus pork. Okay. Any of it, whatever's appropriate, whatever's affordable, whatever's accessible. There is a level of animal source food that is a minimum for human health and flourishing, proper development. Just another way to look at it, 2 billion people, micronutrient deficiencies. You cannot supplement your way out of these. 150 million children under 5 suffer from stunting, and that's a lifelong condition. It's not just stature, it includes mental development. Millions more have impaired cognitive development due to poor nutrition, partly due to insufficient consumption of animal source foods. Animal source foods supply multiple bioavailable nutrients that are lacking in cereal-based diets of the poor. You know, those heart-healthy diets that are now recommended as planetary diets. This is a paper that I recommend out of Shogun's paper 2019, Animal Source Food, Sustainability Problem or Malnutrition and Sustainability Solution. Perspective matters. Oh yeah, it does. From his paper, he gave this plot of annual meat consumption by country against rate of childhood stunting. It's pretty clear that you get below a certain level and the rate of stunting dramatically increases. And oh, by the way, this is the level of intake advocated by the Eat Lancet group in their planetary diet, which would end up resulting in, the high stunting group. I don't think that's going to work real well. And it's not just developing world or low income, middle income countries. In this country, in the United States, over 40% of Americans don't get enough protein. Most females over 8 don't get enough protein. Yeah, I'd call that a shame. I'd also say it's worse because this is based on RDA. I'll talk about that. And this is based on plant source protein and animal source protein being equivalent. And I'll talk about that. Why protein isn't protein. All protein is not created equal. So when it comes to consumption of animal source foods, there is such a thing as too little. Unfortunately, there's this narrative that there's such a thing as too much. What's that based on? Actually, when you start looking for it, there's not a lot of evidence to support that. Unfortunately, too many people doing good work still believe it. It's one of my missions is to get them to kind of let go of that and stop acknowledging it as if it has any validity. Last year, we're probably familiar with the Annals of Internal Medicine papers. 6 papers came out. It was fun to watch the twitching. That was great. Our results from the evaluation of randomized trials do not support the recommendations of the United Kingdom, United States, or World Cancer Research Fund guidelines on red meat intake. Our results highlight the uncertainty regarding causal relationships between red meat consumption and major cardiometabolic and cancer outcomes. Reading these papers, I think if there's an upper limit, it's not in the West at this point. It's not current levels of consumption. And I don't really see much evidence to worry about something showing up later. But in any case, there is such a thing as too little. We haven't found too much. In fact, I say preponderance of evidence from all scientific disciplines strongly suggests the most likely harm associated with meat consumption is from not consuming enough. We have documented harm from too little. We have theories based on nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease concerning too much. We have model output from people worrying about environmental impacts, worrying about too much. But we have concrete evidence of too little. We don't have that evidence of too much. And can we pause just a moment and emphasize that processed animal products are not the same thing as processed plant products? When people talk about this, could we please acknowledge, in fact, there isn't the information to support the health effects that are purported. And now we actually have data showing that when we make processed animal products, we actually increase the digestibility of the indispensable amino acids that are contained in it relative to the raw ingredients that went in. It's improving the nutritional quality of this animal source product. Plus, it's tasty as hell. So we have this challenge coming at us, whether we wish to accept it or not. It's a reality. We have the UN projecting world population will reach 9+ billion by mid-century. By the way, that's not more kids. That's just more of us getting to live longer. Same number of children. UN has called for 100% increase in food production by 2050. Yes, a lot of that can come from eliminating or reducing food waste, but we're still going to have to increase production. The Food and Agriculture Organization predicts a 66% increase in demand for animal protein by 2050. Well, that's really conservative because they're basing that on RDA and they're not accounting for the fact that seniors are going to need more. In any case, it must come from virtually the same land areas today. Yeah, we're not making more of that. But let's start here. The concept that all proteins are of comparable nutritional value is flawed and should be rejected by anyone interested in planning healthful diets. Animal source protein is superior to plant source protein in diets for human beings. Unfortunately, we see these food labels. Oh, look, there's protein, 3 grams. Humans don't digest protein, they digest amino acids. And we have very specific needs for those amino acids. Notice also that they don't give us any percent of calorie recommendation for that. It's just they're hanging that out there. That's interesting. There's a couple other things there we could talk about, not the least of which is calories. They don't even account for calories, right? We do better in animal nutrition than we do in human nutrition, but don't want to get too distracted. So crude protein is what's on that label. It's not true protein. And crude protein is the percent nitrogen multiplied by 6.25. Because we assume that all the nitrogen that was in that or is calculated to be in that is in protein, and all that protein is 16% nitrogen. So it's not true protein. Some proteins contain more or less than 16% nitrogen. Different foodstuffs contain various amounts of non-protein nitrogen, peptides, amino acids that you can read. That's fine in a ruminant. Ruminants can use non-protein nitrogen. Not so much us. In fact, not at all us. There's a difference between crude protein and true protein, and it's greater in plant source foods than it is in animal source foods. And true protein from animal source foods contains a higher proportion of what we have called nutritionally essential amino acids than plant source foods. And this is a list of essential, non-essential, and conditionally essential amino acids. Now, we have traditionally spoken of these as the non-essential, the essential amino acids are the ones that must be in our diet because our bodies cannot synthesize them. And the non-essential ones we haven't worried about so much. And then there are these conditionally essential ones that depends on the situation, individual. Yeah, well, although the concepts of essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids have been used for over a century, growing evidence from studies with pigs, poultry, and fish has shown that animals do have dietary requirements for non-essential amino acids to fulfill their genetic potential for maximum growth, reproduction, lactation, and production performance, as well as optimal health and well-being. Thus, the term nutritionally non-essential amino acids should no longer be used in nutritional sciences. Oh, that's interesting. So in other words, there are amino acids we can make, but there's no evidence that we can make enough if they're not in our diet to some level. That's interesting. So this is one of my claims that for almost 4 decades, swine nutritionists have known and cared more about essential amino acids in the diets they prescribe than human nutritionists have. 4 decades, almost half a century. Maybe it's time. And how might that influence conversations about protein intake and environmental footprint when we look at protein sources? I think it would have a huge impact. And clearly it's the only way you can begin to explain this kind of nonsense, where they want us to believe that broccoli is a better source of protein than beef is. Now, they're doing this on a caloric basis. This points to the whole fallacy or potential fallacy of nutrient density. All depends on how you want to look at it. I think Amber is the one that told me the first time that the most nutrient dense food item you can have is a multivitamin pill. But it's not really all that useful. So you start digging into this a little bit and say, oh, okay, well, here are the, again, essential amino acids. And you could come very close to meeting your requirements for those with 275 calories of steak, which is 4 ounces. It would, if you 277 calories of chopped raw broccoli, and oh, by the way, cooking is going to change things, but okay, just go into the book. Here's the values. So 9¼ cups. Oh, and you're not meeting any of your essential amino acid there from broccoli. So I have no idea where they're bringing this from. 18 cups of broccoli, twice the calories to get all the essential amino acids. Oh boy. Imagine spending quarantine with someone eating 18 cups of broccoli. Talk about your anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. Ugh. Okay. And dietary requirements for amino acids and protein are affected by dietary factors, physiological characteristics, pathological states, environmental factors. All of those need to be taken into account and are in animal nutrition. But we've got kind of this one-size-fits-all idea in human nutrition. RDA, TUL, MOUSC. So the recommended daily allowance, RDA for protein, is currently 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight a day for adults over 18, all of them. But research is showing that higher levels may be needed for adults age 65 plus. We'll get back to that. Long-term consumption of protein at 2 grams per kilogram body weight per day is safe for healthy adults. And the tolerable upper limit is 3.5 grams per kilogram of body weight per day for well-adapted subjects. So there's this tremendous range, but RDA, unfortunately, is too often interpreted as the target when it should be considered the floor, a bare minimum. The adult RDA defined as the average daily level of intake sufficient to meet nutrient requirements for nearly all healthy people. Oh, well, that would be interesting to think about too. When we're living in an age when almost 90% of adult Americans don't enjoy optimal metabolic health, maybe this is inappropriate. But I digest. Let me go along. The RDA for protein for adults greater than equal to 18 years of age, we just talked about that, hasn't been changed for 70 years. Might be time to do that. In practice, RDA for protein derived to estimate the minimum amount of protein must be eaten to avoid a loss of body nitrogen. Maybe there are better ways to measure that. Acceptable macronutrient distribution range 10 to 35% of calories is protein. We'll get back to that idea, but it's in use. And it's interesting that the lowest level of protein intake by AMDR is higher than that for the RDA. That's kind of interesting. Maybe they could get that sorted out. And then recent studies, particularly in older individuals, suggest specific health benefits at levels of protein intake that significantly exceed the RDA. And the reality is today, most of humanity's diet is plant-based. I've shown this before at different meetings, but if you look at the percent of calories in humanity's diet coming from animal versus plant source food, the vast majority of calories are coming from plants, and globally the majority of protein is coming from plant source foods. But note, they're not measuring calories right, and they're also equating protein just on a mass basis, just crude protein, which we've already covered. It's not equivalent. But more protein is supplied to humanity through cereals alone than from all animal source foods. And the reality is we could take some of that cereal and feed it to livestock and increase and improve the protein supply by doing so. It's not a competition. It's actually an enhancement of our food supply if we could do that. The only way you don't get there is if you are wedded to some idea about plant source protein being equivalent or crude protein being a useful concept. Another way to look at the information per capita protein supply, comparing 1961 to 2013, we've made some progress in all these regions of the world. But here is your RDA for a 70 kilogram man. Actually, just kilogram adult, sorry. It's not sex specific. Wonder if that's valid. And if you look at this, then you can understand how things like the recent opinion piece in the New York Times could talk about how we're overeating protein. But it's a myth, because that's the minimum. That's a target. If we start looking for maybe a more informed range of protein intake of maybe 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight, now we start saying we're not doing that kind of overeating that we had been told about. And it's also fair to point out that this is the total grams of crude protein coming from plants and the total amount of crude protein coming from animal source food. So those numbers in the green bit need to be reduced to get to effective or true protein. So we might not even be hitting that blue area at all. And oh, by the way, we have a safe upper limit of 2 and a tolerable upper limit of 3.5 that we could still get to. Looks a little different when we start digging into it. Oh, by the way, here's the Eat Lancet target for meat consumption. So when they say we could get rid of livestock agriculture and make it all up with plants, from where? Because it's going to take a whole lot of plants to make up what they're suggesting. Okay. For the poorest 20% of the tropical population around the world, rice provides more protein per person than beans, meat, and milk. And rice is a really, really, really poor source of protein. That's based on crude protein. That's not looking at the actual amino acids that we need, let alone the limiting essential amino acid, in this case, lysine. There's better evaluations of protein quality than biological value. That's the oldest. We used PD-CAS for a while, PDCAAS. We're hoping to move toward DIAAS, DIAAS, digestible indispensable amino acid score. And when you look at that, you just see just how enormously better beef is as a source of essential amino acids than the rice is. And oh, by the way, animal source food, or maybe put it this way, the plant source protein doesn't come by itself. It brings a lot of other stuff with it, like, carbohydrate, various forms of anti-nutrients. Those are absent in animal source foods. But if we can have a better evaluation of this essential amino acid production, now when we go in and look at environmental footprints, for example, we find that there's not such a difference between the environmental footprint of animal source food production and plant source food production. Maybe this is a better way for us to start evaluating those questions. The notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source food is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. It's a kind word. Again, Dr. Adeshogun's paper, I recommend it highly. But out of the 750 million people living in extreme poverty around the world, about half of them are pastoralists, smallholders or workers relying on livestock for food and livelihoods. So we start these flawed comparisons, negative press, faulty narratives. They have an influence on those people directly, as well as through various policies and funding. We need to push back against them. And I was recently speaking to a researcher who's working in Africa and Southwest Asia, and he's saying that in the midst of the COVID pandemic, people in Ethiopia and Nepal are believing the rumor that animal source food is a vector for COVID. And so now the farmers there face the same problems farmers here do in terms of getting to market, and then people aren't buying the food that's in the market. It's the food that they absolutely must have. So kind of wrapping things up, when it comes to protein in the human diet, please remember that intake target should be a specific amount of high quality protein. Yeah, that's something else. When they give us those RDAs or targets, they're assuming high quality protein or equivalent. Crude protein overestimates the protein content of plant source foods. The biological value of protein from animal source foods is about 1.4 times that of plant source foods. So if you're going to exclude animal source foods from your diet, then please adjust your plant source protein sources accordingly. Protein intake guidelines should not be on a percent of calories basis. If you need certain amount of protein, that's whether you're eating 2,000, 1,000, or 3,000 calories a day. The percent will change, but the amount should not. So again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a licensed dietitian. I'm just a forage agronomist who's walking this himself, and hopefully I've shared some information you find useful. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm all over social media. Please feel free to reach out and get in touch. And I welcome your input and your comments. And I wish everyone good health and look forward to seeing you in person soon.